Welcome to another episode of Stories from the Edge of Life. We have Amy Mann who's back with us today. Welcome back, Amy.
Hi, Parag. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for
Amy,
having me.
of course. Amy, would you mind introducing yourself again to our audience?
Sure. My name's Amy Mann. I am a heart transplant recipient. I'm coming up to 5 years post-heart transplant in August. I had the genetic condition hypertrophic cardiomyopathy prior to that. I've done a lot of other things in my life, living with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. I was a midwife for a number of years in the UK. I'm a mom. I have 4 kids. 3 are grown. 1 is still at home. And right now I do a lot of advocacy work, some contractual work and some volunteer work to try to help others navigate, some of the healthcare journeys that I've had to navigate.
Thank you. And I'm Parag Bharadwaj. I'm a hospice and palliative medicine physician here in the US. So, Amy, this is a unique episode because a lot has been going on in terms of uh, different debates in the heart transplant world. So, tell us what was the enticing point for these discussions to start occurring and what is going on?
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, there was an opinion piece in the New York Times by Amy Silverstein, who's an author. She also has a law degree and she is a double heart transplant. So she's had 2 heart transplants, and she wrote an opinion piece, and she sadly has recently been diagnosed with an uncurable lung cancer. And that's related to years of being on these very strong immunosuppressive regimes that all transplant patients have to be on. Because when you have a transplant, you have an organ in your body that doesn't belong to you. So your immune system naturally would attack that organ. So we have to keep our immune activity very low to prevent what's called rejection. So Amy Silverstein, her opinion piece is really about how there's been a lack of progress in better, safer medications that are effective for transplant recipients to keep our immune systems low, but to prevent a lot of the many, many complications that come along with it. So that's a very current topic. And there's this, she mentioned this gratitude paradox. When you get a transplant, of course, you're so incredibly grateful. And, when you have a deceased donor, which if you're a heart recipient, your donor is deceased, you have this overwhelming knowledge that someone probably young and healthy passed in probably a terrible way. So you have this kind of, I don't know if I would call it survivor's guilt, but you kind of live with that knowledge. So you feel very lucky. And every single day you wake up, certainly for me, I think about my donor and their family, and on anniversaries, it's also prevalent. You're happy that you're still here and you're doing well, but then you're thinking that there's a family that's going through a really, really tough day. So there's this kind of attitude amongst our community, both patients and, I can't really speak for the doctors, but it's almost like, should we ask for more? Should we ask for better? Because truly the immunosuppression regimes really haven't changed very much since the 80s. There's been some change, but there's not been a lot of development. So really, they don't know, doctors can't really say, that these are safe drugs, and after 5 years, they're less safe. So transplant recipients were always at risk of rejection, infection, and malignancies. And those, the malignancies are very often caused by the transplant medications. So we have to be very vigilant. My mom was also a transplant recipient, and she passed away less than a year post-transplant from a malignancy caused by her medication regime. So the article was really about that we need better and we need change in the kind of the culture of the transplant community. And there's been a little bit of backlash too about it. My personal opinion is that, I don't think it's too much to want better. And I think that would be honoring our donors as well, who, a family member who's lost a loved one and they donate their organs. Of course, I'm sure they want us to do really well and live long, healthy lives. I think that, and I've heard from donor families that brings them peace. My mom's donor family was absolutely devastated when she passed away. So that's kind of what's been going on in the transplant community at the moment.
Got it. And what is your personal take based on your personal experience? Explain to us what you go through, as a transplant patient, because I think, uh, as a layman, I would think that once you get the heart transplant, okay, you are on some extra pills to prevent rejection, but then for the most part, you have your life back.
Yeah. So Prague, for my personal take, it's not like that at all. It's not the case that, you kind of get your transplant, you recover, you take a couple pills every day and everything's hunky-dory. I wish that was the case. And I will say that everyone's transplant journey is different. I've worked and talked to a lot of transplant recipients, and there's a big range. Some people do very well for a number of years without a lot of, intervention or issues. My personal experience is probably somewhere in between. That my first year post-transplant, I struggled with several episodes of moderate rejection. So I was up and down on very high doses of prednisone, and at one point I took a chemotherapy drug to try to get the rejection under control, and it did get under control, but I was very sick the first year. I felt awful. The medications are very harsh on your system. I worked very hard, did everything right. I went to cardiac rehab, did all those things. And eventually I got past that hot phase where, the first year you're at the most risk of rejection, and there's quite a few people who struggle with it. And then, you kind of, I slowly kind of got better and recovered, but I've had issues with infection. I've been hospitalized a couple times with infection because our immune systems are, chemically underactive. So, we're at very high risk. So we have to be very careful, especially now. I know COVID is no longer a so-called health emergency, but for us, we're still very high risk. And, so we live our lives having to be very vigilant. For me, if I'm inside somewhere where there's lots of people, I will still wear a mask. We have extra boosters for, vaccines to help us, from getting severe COVID. So there's risks of infections. And then personally for me, over the last kind of year and a half, I've lost a significant amount of weight unintentionally. And, it's kind of brought to the attention of my team. And there's always that scare of cancer, because when you lower someone's immune system, any cancer cells are kind of much more free to multiply, if that's kind of a lay way of putting it. So in recent months, I've undergone a lot of imaging, CT scans, different tests, and there's been some little things that have been found. So it's led to other tests that I've had to go through that are invasive. So far, everything's okay. As from a cancer point of view, I have a liver scan coming up, which I'm hopeful will be okay. But one thing that has come out of these investigations And it was a suspicion from my cardiologist all along, is that I have something called secondary adrenal insufficiency, which basically means that my body doesn't produce enough cortisol. And one of the side effects of that is weight loss, hypotension, like getting up, you get very dizzy. It's hard to kind of, when you get sick, it's hard to get well quicker. Like it just takes you longer. And the cause of this, they believe, is all of the really high doses of prednisone, which is it's many things, but it's also an immunosuppressant, and it's given to you in very high doses when you have rejection. So I had a lot of that the first year, and over the last couple of years, every single time I've been sick or under a lot of stress, I've become very symptomatic. I've lost a lot of weight. I've become very fatigued. So I've now been diagnosed with that, and I take replacement cortisol in the form of hydrocortisone. So that's definitely helped me feel better, and I'm slowly putting on some weight, and I'm hopeful that that's the only reason why, I've lost a lot of weight. But, I'm under the care of a hepatologist at the moment. We'll have a liver scan. I've had some other scans and other things that, so far have been negative, but that's where I'm at. Not quite 5 years post-transplant. And it does kind of feel like, you're trading, of course, when you're in a heart failure, you're dying, and this is your lifeline, is a transplant. But it's not a fix all. It comes with a host of other issues for most people. And the lifespan of a transplanted organ is generally, they're depending on where you get the statistics from, they seem to vary, but they say it's 10 to 15 years. But then, there's people who transplant older, who have other comorbidities, and it's a very difficult thing to measure. And I've recently had a meeting with UNOS, because I do a project with them, and they said themselves that it's very hard to give statistics about transplant, because it's hard to track why people pass away post-transplant, because it could be a mixture of reasons. It could have nothing to do with transplant. It could have everything to do with medications, and it's not something they really measure.
All right. So, Amy, you've covered a few things. Number one, glad to hear that all your tests so far have been negative. Touch wood. Hopefully, it'll continue to be the same. And the other thing I just wanted to ask you was, for the sake of our audience, what is UNOS?
So UNOS is the United Network for Organ Sharing, and they're kind of they're a nonprofit, but they're kind of the central agency in America that kind of governs the rules around organ transplant. I couldn't tell you everything that they do because it's very complicated, but they basically run the technology. So when you go on the list, they get your information, and then below UNOS is the organ procurement organizations by region, right? So UNOS runs a central database, and when organs become available in a region, it then goes to the organ procurement organizations, who then it goes to, the organ will kind of go to whoever is on the list. It will be offered. Like there's offers, and depending on so many different factors, the organs will be accepted or rejected, and it's a very complicated system. But UNOS is really they kind of govern, and they set the rules and the expectations for the organ procurement organizations, and then below them you have the transplant centers. So it's a very complicated network.
Got it. And the other point I just wanted to cover was, yes, heart transplant patients do sometimes end up getting more than one heart transplant. And you mentioned Amy, she had two, and I actually took care of a patient who was in line for his third one. And
Wow.
yeah, so it's not unusual,
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
least
And
where I
some,
worked. Yeah,
yeah.
so yeah, so where do you see things going from here? You did say, I made a note of it. Is it too much to ask for better? And I think nobody can say it better than the person who's going through the experience, right? So what do you
Yeah.
think needs to get better?
That's a interesting question. And I think it's a little bit loaded because there's a lot of people who have different opinions about it, because there is an attitude that, well, what else more do you want? We've saved your life. And some of that is internalized by the recipient. Everyone loves the good story, the walking miracle, but you know, like someone with lupus, if they wanted or asking, please invest in, better treatments, no one would think twice about it. you know sure, there's a lot of diseases that are underfunded as far as research and looking at better, but it's never questioned that you know that better would be a good thing. My personal view is that we do need better. um I'm very grateful, and I feel like I owe it to my donor to live my best life possible. And, it's a fine dance because we don't want to go through rejection, but we also don't want to suffer the very toxic effects of these medications. So for me, better looks like, I know there is some research going on into better immunosuppression, but it's very, very hard to figure out who's doing it. I've done extensive research. But essentially the regime has not changed. Everyone's slightly different, and it's individualized per person because different patients tolerate different medications better. But the truth is that all the medications put you at risk of a lot of diseases: osteoporosis, cancer, diabetes, kidney failure, all kinds of things. So is it too much to ask for better? I don't think so. I think that, um, you know, there's also this other thing, like I transplanted young, relatively young. So, if you're 65 and you transplant, 15 years might seem fine to you. It might seem that's great. For me, I still have a kid at home. I have four children, but I still have a young one. And, I would love for there to be investment in drugs that will be safer for us. And the other area that I feel like there needs to be better is better support post-transplant. And I think that's felt by many patients. When you're going through the process, there's pretty good support. There's a lot that you have to do to even get on the list. You have to have all kinds of medical evaluations, psychiatric evaluations. There's all oodles of bloods, like, testing to, make, for the matching. And, it's all very complicated. And when you're first going through it and you go through it, you're pretty well supported. But after you're done and you go home, you see your team regularly for follow-up, and they're fantastic at taking care of you medically. At least my team is, and I think most teams are. But we've been through a lot, Parag. It's a lot of what I think that a lot of people don't understand. With, in particular, heart transplant, I can't speak really for other transplant recipients, but there's, especially in the beginning, a lot of invasive testing. So, for example, we go through heart biopsies where they go through a vein through your neck or your groin or your wrist, and they take little pieces of your heart out to test for rejection. And during my first year, I had somewhere around the region of 26 and biopsies, and that's a lot. And it's very, for me personally, and many other recipients I know, it's a very traumatizing experience. And, you know, as far as what if there is available, certainly within the teams I've been in, I have moved. So I've been, you know, through 3 teams actually. And there's really not any kind of systematic post-transplant support. If you look for it or groups, you might be able to find it. If you have the means or the health insurance that covers therapy, that might be helpful. But even therapists, I've had therapists who've reached out to me that I know that are friends who are like, oh, I've got a transplant patient. What can you tell me? What resources are available? And I'm like, well, there's not a lot. You know, some hospitals or transplant centers do have their own support groups. They tend to be very large. It's not helpful for everybody. Some people it is helpful for. So I think that, you know, more holistic care, you know, more of the social psychological care would be helpful as well.
Thank you, Amy, for speaking for yourself. And like you shared, most of your, most of the other transplant recipients that, feel the same way. So I did notice one thing. I'm curious to ask, every time you talk about your donor, you put your hand on your heart. Is that does that come naturally?
It does, yeah. I mean, you know, like I don't know who my donor is, but I feel very protective over this precious gift, you know, and I feel very, you know, I don't know my donor's family, but I feel so much love and sadness and grief for them, and maybe there's a sense of pressure that I want to live my best life for them and give back and be a kind person and try to, I guess, you know, the life that my young donor wasn't able to live. You know, it's this kind of strange, unless you're a transplant recipient, it's hard to describe. But I do know it's a common feeling that, you know, it's just, I want to honor my transplant recipient, and, you know, they're there with me, you know, and so part of me lives for them.
Thank you for sharing that, Amy, and thank you for being a voice for others like you, and like you said, for the heart that you carry. So we hope that in the near future there'll be more investment in trying to study in terms of how to make the lives of post heart transplant patients more easier, and perhaps basing it on the feedback from the patients themselves, which it sounds to me, for a variety of reasons, patients hesitate, right? Because,
Yeah.
uh, like you said, it's a gratitude paradox. Should they be asking for more? And are they being asked? Right.
Mm.
All right. So with that, we will conclude our interview, and we look forward to getting more updates down the road.
Right. Thank you, Parag.
Thank you, Amy.
All right. Thanks.